Thank you very much indeed, Gavin. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this morning. First, to state the obvious, the country is in crisis, and we're suffering. The government is preoccupied by Brexit to the exclusion of all else, when so much else requires urgent attention. Investors are losing confidence. Our reputation as the repository of that great British virtue, common sense, is evaporating. The nation is bitterly divided. But Europe, to a degree, also has a Brexit crisis. Reflect for an instant on the bizarre nature of the European Council last night. 28 leaders of modern developed nations, plus Commission officials, all long steeped in experience of every variety of European challenge. Every one of those leaders, to a man or woman, believing that they're obliged to facilitate something which everyone thinks is a bad idea for Europe and for Britain. Not one believing that this course is better than Britain staying in Europe. All of them recognize that in the years to come, this decision will be regretted by future generations. Each of them aware that in a changing world, Brexit will make Europe weaker and our values, never mind our interests, harder to protect. Yet all feeling this strange compulsion to carry on, not regardless, by the way, because all have regard to the consequences, but helpless because it seems it must be so. Things do not need to be like this. We're not in a state of hypnosis to do this. We can assume consciousness. We have free will, and it's past time to exercise it. There is a tendency in many quarters, not least Downing Street, to treat Brexit as some form of natural disaster, something which has come about through force majeure, dictated by fate. Brexit is man-made. It can be unmade by man. We simply must discover the will to change. I direct this message today, however, not only to politicians here, but to those of Europe. Between now and the 21st of January, we should see whether it is possible to find a majority consensus for any form of Brexit in Parliament. In the meantime, we should prepare for the eventuality that there isn't such a consensus. Politicians should debate and discuss the different options. Europe should prepare for the possibility, now morphing into the near probability, that Britain will require an extension of time to the Article 50 process, either to negotiate further or, more likely, to conduct a new referendum, a people's vote. Our present situation is unique in modern British politics. The government is not in control, not of the agenda, not of events, and certainly not of the outcome. What is stranger is that they're not really positioning themselves to take control. Instead, they're saying it is this Theresa May deal or no deal, when it's clear that there is a consensus against the first and equally a consensus to avoid the second. In politics, the flip side of a politician's strength is often their weakness. There is sincere admiration for the doggedness of the Prime Minister in keeping on, despite all the shenanigans. But at a moment when we need imagination and creativity to find a way through, which accepts that the original plan may be unobtainable, there is a curious purblind reluctance even to consider one. Therefore, it is outside the normal processes of government where we must seek a solution. One unlooked-for benefit of Brexit is that many members of Parliament, irrespective of party, are talking with each other, working with each other, discussing all possibilities, with a genuine desire to find an answer and not an advantage. And one sensible thing the Prime Minister has done is to allow for the possibility of throwing the matter forward to late January, and so to permit discussion without the prospect of an immediate vote forcing people off their various fences. And this is positive. So there may emerge out of this a consensus, or at least a majority. But, you know, there's been one pattern to the Brexit debate so far. Every potential solution has had its moment in the sun, but then things have clouded over. The so-called Norway model is the latest to succumb, precisely because of all the drawbacks of the Theresa May deal, making us a rule taker, indeed more so. Over the last 30 months, it has become apparent that 45 years of British membership of the European Union has intertwined us with Europe in ways which make disentangling us hideously complex. Thus, we've ended up with what I call the painful versus pointless Brexit dilemma, which has haunted the negotiation. To begin with, seemingly in ignorance of the technical and political realities, the government thought it could pursue a cake-and-eat-it strategy. David Davis promised, if you remember, that we would secure a deal which took us out of the single market, but with exactly the same benefits as being in it. Once it became clear that either we stayed in step with Europe's single market rules to minimize economic disruption, i.e. become rule takers, not rule makers, that's pointless Brexit, or broke away to make our own rules, but therefore with such economic disruption, painful Brexit, and that this choice was essentially binary, the Prime Minister plumped for pointless with the Chequers proposal. And the Irish question is an additional and fundamental problem, but it's really another manifestation of the same dilemma. A frictionless border between North and South in Ireland is only possible if the two are part of the same trading system, i.e. the single market and customs union. Such a border and the claim around it was not a concession by the British government, by the way. It started as a demand. Europe said yes, Ireland naturally said yes, and rightly, Europe has said it will stand by that decision, and indeed so should we. But of course, it completely undermines the other negotiating objectives of the government. Now, it's not clear as we speak if the Chequers proposal is extant. But what has been revealed by the whole negotiation process is that all the Brexit options have significant drawbacks when compared with staying in the European Union. It is this pursuit of incompatible ends through inept means that has led us to the present impasse. And I do not believe this impasse is resolvable by agreement on the form of Brexit, because neither pointless nor painful is attractive. One or other part of the Conservative Party will rebel, and the Labour Party will oppose. However, let's try. Let's see if a majority consensus develops. If it doesn't, if we can't find an option that meets approval in Parliament with a majority for Brexit, then the choice is between going back to the people and no deal. But surely this much is plain, if nothing else is. Whatever is the proper interpretation of the June 2016 mandate, it cannot seriously be said to be no deal. And Parliament has rightly set its face against such an outcome. Therefore, to insist that we crash out with all the disastrous implications of no deal, rather than put the matter back to the people, would be an extraordinary dereliction of duty. And I don't see it happening for that reason. But that is why it is therefore completely perverse to spend time, Europe or the UK government, in preparation for no deal, rather than in what is a much more likely outcome, which is a new vote. Now, there are still many who argue that such a vote would be undemocratic, others that it would be divisive without being decisive. And these are important arguments which need to be dealt with. I argued for a final say referendum back in October 2016 on the basis that such a huge decision required the right to reconsider once the negotiation proceeded to a clear deal. I think that argument was strong then, but the argument today is infinitely more compelling. We've had 30 months of negotiation. Universally, it is accepted that this negotiation has been massively more fraught than anyone ever imagined. Just go back and read the speeches of government ministers in the first flush of excitement post-referendum, and read them now. Survey the political wreckage of the past weeks. Ministers resigning, the Brexit deal derided by those who most vehemently campaigned for Brexit, unable to put the deal to a vote, the Prime Minister herself put to the vote, surviving but barely, back to Europe for words that no one seriously believes will rescue her cause, several different versions of Brexit but none able to command a parliamentary majority, chaos, the character of this process, no viable solution in sight, the clock, which should never have been set, ticking, now ticking ever louder as we approach the midnight hour. All of this, by the way, while domestically, in the last 24 hours alone, we've seen reports of 12-hour waits for beds in A&E having doubled, the highest level of knife and weapons offenses since 2010, and a 120% increase in rough sleeping. How can it be said, how can it seriously be said that in these circumstances, given the riot of confusion we find ourselves in, that it is wrong to go back to the people and clarify whether in the light of all of this, they wish to stay or leave? I simply ask, in what other decision of consequence in our lives, where there's a stipulated time between the original decision and the due date, where we've had 30 months of brutal education of reality, when our knowledge of the consequence is a world greater than it was when we took the decision, in what other circumstances would we refuse the right to reconsider, refuse even to contemplate a change of mind, indeed regard discussion of such a change as somehow a betrayal of principle? Would we take such an attitude towards the time between engagement and marriage, if that time was as hapless as ours been since the referendum of June 2016 and the state of the nation today? Or towards the time between accepting the job offer and taking it up? Or the time between deciding to move to a new home and the reality of inspecting it? If our knowledge of reality in any of these situations changed, would we really abhor the prospect of reconsideration? Given all that has happened, the undemocratic thing is to deny people a final say. Of course, there is discussion of the precise question a referendum would pose. But the difference between now and June 2016 is really about context. In a new referendum, both sides will be able to make their case in the context of the experience of the Brexit negotiation and what we've learned through it. I mean, who can seriously argue that we do not know more today than we did in June 2016? Today we know, and let me be fair to the Brexiteers, there was not a recession following the vote, unemployment has carried on falling, and wages have risen slightly. On the other hand, we know that our currency has been severely devalued, investment and growth badly affected, and no one can credibly stick £350 million extra for the NHS on the bus next time. We know that since the referendum, European migration is down. We understand much more about what such migrants actually do, and immigration from the rest of the world is up. The point, very simply, is that claim and counterclaim are this time going to be influenced by fact. As for the charge that such a new referendum will divide the country or produce an explosion of popular anger, I say we're divided now. And are people really going to be angry to be asked to give an answer when Parliament cannot? So far from being a source of disunity, if, as I suggest, both sides make a formal agreement that the decision is final, no matter how narrow, it will bring what all sides truly now crave, which is closure. But go ahead without such a final say, especially on the terms of the Theresa May deal. And for a certainty, both ardent Brexiteers and Remainers will feel angry and betrayed. And because of the deliberate ambiguity of the deal, the argument will continue, not abate. So, what seemed a few months ago unlikely is now, I would say, above a 50% likelihood. We will go back to the people. Ultimately, this could even make sense to the Prime Minister, who could perfectly legitimately say, I did my best, my deal was rejected by Parliament, and you, the people, must give direction because Parliament cannot. There are two important pieces of polling relevant here. A year ago, support for the people's vote was not above 30%. Today, it is the most supported outcome and growing in strength. And as the negotiation has gone on its wild and wacky way, the numbers believing that the original decision is sensible has declined. European leadership must also catch up with these developments and begin preparation. If Britain were to choose to have a new referendum, we would need Article 50 to be extended. We would need a solution to the European Parliament elections, though adequate precedent is available. But above all, Europe would need to decide whether to take an historic opportunity and set out a new offer to the British people, which also answers the concerns of citizens across Europe, particularly on the questions of immigration and the freedom of movement principle, the control of Europe's borders, and the acceptance that inevitably those inside the Eurozone will integrate differently from those outside it. Such an offer would itself add justification to the case for a people's vote, but more than that, it would show that the political leadership of Europe and of Britain had listened to the underlying concerns of those who voted Brexit, not disrespecting those concerns, but meeting them in a way which is not damaging. Any Remain campaign in Britain could underline such a point by advocating measures directed at assisting those people and communities who, after the long years of austerity, need support. Now, Europe may say, this is all very well, but how do we do this if your government won't cooperate? I say to them, I understand that, but put it out there. Let British politics respond. Cease to be passive spectators in the debate which, after all, impacts your interests, Europe's interests, and not just Britain's. Tell Britain you want us to stay. Set the agenda of what could happen if we do. So, we are now entering a new phase of this Brexit debate. Government has lost the initiative. Parliament has taken it. We know the options for Brexit. Parliament will have to decide on one of them. If Parliament can't decide on any of them, then it should decide to go back to the people. Now, therefore, should be the time of preparation. Parliament to make sure it can canvass the options in a sensible manner, one by one, to reach agreement on an option or a referendum. Europe to ensure that if Britain is ready to think again, Europe is ready also to think again. All that's necessary is for leadership. In Parliament, if not in government, and in Europe, where despite all the myriad of challenges European leaders have, they should understand that changing Brexit will be the single greatest boost to Europe's economy and politics, and that therefore they need to focus on the part they can play and play it. It's a very simple thing sometimes in politics, is to understand what seems inevitable is not. Our fate is now in our hands. I say to politicians here and in Europe, think in your heart and in your mind of what you believe is right. Think of future generations who are going to have to live with the consequences of your decision. Think of why you came into politics. think through what is necessary to do, and then do it. Thank you.